Good morning. Today we're going to be discussing the life and some of the teachings of one of the great Jewish leaders in the former Soviet Union, the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson, who's passing, the anniversary of his passing, his yahrzeit was yesterday, the 20th day of the month of Av. Every year the Rebbe would have a special gathering to honor his father, a way of connecting things in ways that were unprecedented. Let me just I don't know how old he was, but he was very young when he was ordained by the leading Torah authorities of his time. And it seems that he went specifically to non-Hasidic rabbis to test him, because Hasidic rabbis might have been biased in his favor. So he went to Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik, whose actually yahrzeit is today. He passed away in 1918. And he was tested very, very rigorously. And of course, he passed the test with flying colors. At the age of 22, he married his wife Chana, who was the daughter of a great rabbi, Rabbi Meir Shlomo Yanovsky, who was the rabbi of the city of Nikolaev. Most Jews have never heard of that city until the war in Ukraine, when that was, I think they pronounce it Nikolaev. What? Nikolaev. With an N or an M? I think they changed it to an M.
It's Ukrainian.
Right. But his father, the Rebbe's father's father-in-law, was the rabbi of Nikolaev, and they stayed there for about a decade and fathered three sons. Of course, the oldest son was the Rebbe. The middle son, Dov Ber, who perished in the Holocaust. He was in a hospital, and the Germans murdered everyone in the hospital. And his youngest son was Yisrael Aryeh Leib, who was also a genius. People would argue who was a bigger genius, the Rebbe or his younger brother. And he became a scientist, a mathematician, and passed away very young in his early 40s. The picture you have over here is the Rebbe at the age of 2. It's incredible that we have that picture. That's 1904. At the age of 31, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak was appointed a rabbi of one synagogue in the city of Yekaterinoslav, which was the czarist name to the city. It was changed to Dnepropetrovsk, if you could pronounce it, you get extra credit. And now it changed to Dnepro. They shortened it, thank God. We don't have to break our teeth. The dentists were losing a lot of money now. And it's interesting, the Yekaterinoslav at that time was not a religious town. Most of the Jews there were secular. There was a very prominent secular Zionist representation there. And little by little, he won the hearts of all the members of the community. And he was so well respected that he was appointed the chief rabbi of the city. But he wasn't just a rabbi who said sermons and counseled people and gave classes. He did all that, of course. But he was an activist at the time when Stalin was in charge of the Soviet Union and banning religious practice. And he never gave in to the pressure from the Soviets. He oversaw the building of a new mikveh. That was illegal. They tried to cover up all the mikvahs in Russia at that time. One of my close colleagues' father would go from town to town with forged documents from Moscow ordering them to build mikvahs. They caught on to that ruse after a few months, but he got a few mikvahs built. But that was putting your life in danger. He officiated clandestinely at Jewish weddings and circumcisions. There was a story where there was a wedding in his house. Couldn't have it in the public place. He had it in his house. And for a wedding, you need a minyan. And they only had 9 men. But upstairs lived the manager of the house, who was a Jew, but he was a communist. And he was in charge of spying on the rabbi. So they needed a 10th man. Where do you get it? You can't just go outside in the street and say, anyone a 10th man for the minyan? So he went upstairs and he convinced the communist spy to come down to be the 10th man in the minyan, which he did, and it changed his whole, he celebrated with everyone during that wedding, and it changed his whole attitude. He became very active in helping Jews in their Jewish practices. There was a story the Rebbe recounted about matzah. The Soviet Union didn't mind Jews eating matzah because you had to pay for the matzah, and the money went into the coffers of the regime. And they asked, but they needed to have a very prominent rabbi to say that he certifies that the matzah is kosher for Passover. Otherwise, Jews won't buy it. So they went to Rabbi Levi Yitzchak because he was the rabbi of one of the largest cities in Ukraine and very, very well respected. And he said, absolutely not going to give supervision to the matzah unless you give me the full authority to appoint the rabbis to be the supervisors and follow my instructions to the letter. Otherwise, I'm not interested. Now, you don't say that to the Stalinist regime. And they, of course, they resisted that. So he traveled to Moscow and he met with the president of Russia. Now, you have to know the president of Russia is not like the president of the United States or the president of France. It was more like a figurehead. The chairman of the Communist Party was really the one who ran the country, but he still had some clout and some influence. I think his name was Kalinin. So he finally gave the Rabbi Levi Yitzchak the full authority to supervise the matzah, and orders were given that everything the rabbi asks for, you have to give him no matter how much it will cost. And I think there was one incident where one of the trains that was carrying the wheat had a leak in the roof, and the wheat became wet. You can't use that for Pesach. And he says, no, we're not using that train load, which was a major loss to the government, but they had no choice. They had to comply. So he was a Schneerson. There's 2 things about Schneersons. This is a general rule. There are some exceptions, that they were all brilliant, and they were feisty, and they wouldn't stop for anything. Nothing would stop them. It reminds me of, this is a little story that illustrates this point. On Rosh Hashanah, you have Tashlich. Tashlich is where you go to the body of water and you cast out your sins symbolically. And the Rebbe would go to the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, which was about a mile or so from 770 Eastern Parkway, and there would be a whole procession of hundreds, maybe over 1,000 Hasidim who would follow the Rebbe to the Botanical Gardens. And one year it was raining, I'm not going to say cats and dogs, they're not kosher, sheep and goats. It was raining sheep and goats, and the Rebbe wasn't deterred by that, and the Rebbe marched ahead of a whole group of hundreds of Hasidim, older men, young people, children, and they came to the Botanical Gardens, and the gates were locked. Without any hesitation, without a second, the Rebbe climbed the fence, jumped over, and everyone else followed suit. The older people needed assistance. The Rebbe didn't allow anyone to help him, and he just jumped. Nothing could stand in the way of a Schneerson. That was the trademark of the Schneerson. And the Rebbe obviously inherited this from his father, as well as from his father-in-law, who was the previous Rebbe. But that's another subject. On the 9th day of Nisan, March 28, 1939, at 3 a.m., agents of the NKVD, that was the Soviet secret police, the forerunner of the KGB, searched the home. They went through all of his belongings, and at 6 a.m. they arrested him. And what was the charge? That he was doing counter-revolutionary activity because he was promoting Judaism, and not in an unabashed way. It took about a year of torture, interrogation, and he was transferred from one prison to another, I think a total of 5 prisons. He was sentenced to 5 years of exile in Central Asia. Now you think, well, it's not Siberia, so it wasn't so bad. It was just as bad as Siberia, because he was sent to a little town called Chili in Kazakhstan, and he was kept in a room of a little hut owned by a crude Tartar couple. It had no door, so they had no privacy. It was damp, it was muddy, filled with mosquitoes. They suffered from extreme poverty, discomfort, and starvation. But you know what was the worst part of it for him? This man had such a fertile mind. He had written thousands upon thousands of pages of commentary, and he had no books. He had no books, and he had no ability to write. And his word processor wasn't working, I guess. So that was torture for him. But finally, when his wife came to join him, his wife wasn't sentenced to this exile, so she eventually joined him to be with him. She brought some books, a copy of the classic work, the Tanya. It's a relatively small book, 300 pages, and the Zohar, 3 volumes, which is a total of about 1,000 pages. And she manufactured ink from herbs. And he wrote on the margin of his books that he had. And you can see a copy of it in the last page over here. You see that's a copy of a page of the Zohar. And the margins were filled with his commentary for the full 1,000 pages. He just filled the margin of 1,000 pages of commentary. And when the Rebbe's mother, when Rabbi Levi Yitzchak's wife, Chana, left the Soviet Union, she smuggled these books out. Most of his writings are lost because the communists and the Germans both laid their filthy hands on his writings, and we don't know what happened. Did they destroy them? Did they confiscate them? We have no knowledge of it. And the Rebbe writes in a certain footnote that meanwhile I don't have access to it. So the meanwhile, I think, gives us some hope that maybe one day we'll find it. Because they did find a lot of things that were confiscated by the Soviets. Many manuscripts and many books were found and were returned to the rightful owner. When in 1944 his sentence was coming to an end, but his health deteriorated and he was suffering from malignancy. Apparently that was what took his life in the end. But he was able to, and I'm making a long story short, he had friends who were able to secure his release, but he wasn't allowed to go back to his hometown or any other big city, but they moved him to Almaty. Now I think they call it Almaty. Almaty is a large city. I think it's the capital of Kazakhstan. What? It used to be the capital, but it's a major city in Kazakhstan, and there was a Jewish community there, unlike the place where he was before. And this was a tremendous relief for him because now he had a Jewish community. He could teach Torah to them, he could counsel them. And even though he was very weak and very sick, his house was open to all sorts of people, just as if he was back again at home. Despite the dire conditions that and all his health deficits. On the 20th day of the month of Av, in 1944, his condition turned critical. He wasn't able to speak, although he was able to, they heard him murmuring different words of Torah or Psalms. And at one point he said to the people, the last time he was able to speak, it's time to go to the other side. Those were apparently his last words that we could decipher. And then he passed away the 20th of Av. It's interesting that when the news came a few days later to the Rebbe was not home. He was in his study, and they came to notify the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says, "I know. That's why I came to my study, because I was waiting to hear the news." The Rebbe's connection to his father was extremely close. The Rebbe, during that period, the Rebbe sent packages to his father. He tried to do everything in his power to help his father, and the Rebbe always felt tremendous guilt and pain that he wasn't able to observe the mitzvah of honoring his father the way he thought he should have. Of course, it was nothing he could do about it. But anyone who did help his father, the Rebbe was so eternally grateful to that person, and for decades would show the person give special recognition for anyone who did anything to help his father and mother. But his mother made it out of Russia, and she ultimately moved to Crown Heights, and the Rebbe would visit her every day until her passing. As I mentioned before, she smuggled out the few books that he had covered with his commentary on the margins, and they were eventually published together with letters that the Rebbe had from him, so they had something from him, and into 5 volumes. And incredible brilliance. Just to give you an example of his brilliance, that you don't have to know what he says there, but he makes references to different pages of the Talmud. He didn't have a copy of the Talmud, but he makes references, Talmud just in this volume, and this page. And thousands of references to works of Jewish mysticism, of Kabbalah, without having any books with which to consult. His mind was encyclopedic, but the intricacy and the depth of his writings is legendary. When the books were finally published by the Rebbe devoted every Shabbos to taking one of his father's comments and expounding on it. And that produced 5 volumes of commentary, of the Rebbe's commentary on his father's teachings. Now, as I mentioned at the very beginning, he passed away on the 20th day of the month of Av. So the Rebbe, whenever he spoke about this day, or many times when he spoke about this day, he focused on the significance of this day. Now, if you go around asking someone who's not familiar with the Rebbe's teachings, what happened on Tisha B'Av? Well, everyone knows the temples were destroyed. What happened on the 15th of Av? We had a whole class last week. 7 different things happened. People know about it. What happened on the 20th of Av? I guarantee you can test any rabbi who's not connected to the Rebbe's teachings. He will not be able to tell you what happened on the 20th of Av. But the Rebbe, in several of his talks, refers to, he says, I found one reference to it in the whole Talmud, the 20th of Av. What happened on that day? And the Rebbe connected it to his father on several occasions. What happened on that day was, in the days of the temple, I mentioned this last week, the most important commodity in the temple was wood, because you cannot bring a sacrifice unless you have wood, because you had to burn parts of the sacrifice on the altar. Now you can't burn things without fuel, and the fuel they had those days was wood. But wood was not always available. When you got to the end of the season, last week, 15th of Av, they disqualified any wood. Why? Because the sun was not shining as brightly, and the wood would be moist, and moist wood was usually wormy, and wormy wood was not proper to be used for the temple. So there was a period of time during the calendar when you couldn't chop down any more trees, you couldn't get wood. But there were certain families who decided to donate wood. They collected wood over the course of the year, and when there was a shortage of wood in the temple, they would donate wood. And there was one family who donated wood on the 20th day of the month of Av. And that day became a holiday for them. They designated it as a holiday because they were so in a state of joy that they were able to fulfill a mitzvah of supplying the temple with wood, that they celebrated. It became a major celebration. Now, the Rebbe analyzes this. What are the sacrifices for? Many of the sacrifices were there for people who committed sins. The people who donated the wood were thinking about how they can help those unfortunate people gain atonement. So they would spend weeks and maybe months of saving up wood, which was it's like, wood in those days was not just for the temple. Wood was used for all sorts of things, for cooking, for heating, and they would give away some of their hard-earned commodity of wood, thinking about people who were sinners. And it brought them such joy that they were able to help those people that they celebrated that day every year. Every year that day they would give wood and they would make a big celebration. And there were a few days in the year when different families would do this. And the first family that was known for this was the family that donated on the 20th of Av. Now the Talmud has a dispute which family this was. Some say it was a family that were descendants of King David. Some say it was a family that were descendants of General Yoav. If you're familiar with the book of Shmuel, Samuel, you'll know that King David had a general whose name was Yoav, who was a really powerful general. There was some rivalry between them, but that's not the subject that the Rebbe discusses. And he was a major general, he was an incredible general, and that's how King David won all the wars. Many people have the picture of King David as a warrior. Yes, he was involved in some wars. He did kill poor Goliath. Imagine that, taking an innocent guy, Goliath, who came from Gaza, and killing him with a rock. What right did King David have to do that? The UN should banish King David because of what he did, the horrible act of killing Goliath. After all, Goliath was in Gaza. He was suffering. So King David did not fight most of the wars personally. He would stay home and study Torah, while Yoav would go out and fight the battles. And the Talmud says that King David was always grateful to Yoav, because if not for you, I would have to be out there fighting the battles. Now that you're fighting the battles, I could study Torah. And Yoav was grateful to King David. He says, if you wouldn't be studying Torah, I would never win the wars. And that's a little bit of a commentary of those who criticize the people who want to study Torah in Israel. I'm not going to get into the whole subject, but they have a point that the study of Torah is what protects the Jewish people. And if we wouldn't have people studying Torah, the question you could ask, how many people have to do it? But you need to have people studying Torah in order to get God's help, because the military itself cannot guarantee victory. You need to have the spiritual support. So King David would be grateful to Yoav for fighting the battles so he could study Torah in peace. And Yoav, the general, the warrior, would thank King David that he was studying Torah, which gave him the ability to be victorious in his wars. So there was a symbiotic relationship, a complementary relationship between King David and General Yoav. And there's a dispute in the Talmud. This family that brought the wood on the 20th of Av, were they descendants of David, or were they descendants of Yoav, the general? So the Rebbe explains, what's the big difference? Why is that such an important point? And the Rebbe says, because what inspired the people to be so magnanimous, to be so giving of their wood and saving it up for weeks and months to help sinners, to be so kind and compassionate and devoted, the question is, what was it on that day, the 20th of Av, that inspired them? What was the inspiration? And one opinion says it was the inspiration of King David's study of Torah. That it was his study of Torah that was studied by King David with such devotion, such unassuming devotion to the study of Torah. The Talmud says that when King Saul was told about King David, he said, what does he have that I don't have? And when they pointed out a lot of different qualities, he says, I have that as well. When they pointed out that King David, when it comes to matters of Torah, he always wins his arguments, that God is always with him. And King Saul says, I can't match that. I don't always win the arguments in Torah. God is not always with me in Torah. So the Rebbe explains what that means is King David's study of Torah was totally selfless. There was no ego whatsoever. He was just totally devoted to absorbing God's wisdom without his own personal gain and benefit. So he devoted his life, he gave his life for the Torah. And you have to marvel and admire people that you can disagree with their focus, I'm not going to go into the argument, but the people who just devote their whole lives to study Torah. Well, let me give you tell you a little anecdote. There was a group of prisoners, minimum security prisoners, that were given a 2-week furlough. So the Chabad rabbi in Florida took them to a yeshiva in Morristown, New Jersey, so they can be there for 2 weeks and to study Torah. And which person doesn't want to get out of prison for 2 weeks? So they all come there. After 2 days, some of them said, please, let us get back to prison. Because when you go in the yeshiva, you're up in the morning, 6, 7 in the morning, and you're studying 14 hours. To sit and study 14 hours is not easy. And to do that 7 days a week, 365 days a year for 30, 40 years, it takes a certain amount of tenacity, a certain amount of devotion. So the question is, what was the power that these people have? What motivated these people to be so magnanimous, to be so charitable and so compassionate? One opinion says it was the fact that they traced themselves back to King David. They inherited King David's devotion to the study of Torah. The other opinion says no, it was because of their connection to Yoav, the general, who was the activist, who wasn't just doing things for himself, but was fighting battles, putting his life on the line. And I think that debate is going on in Israel today also. Who is more responsible for the victory? Who is deserves more credit? The people who are studying Torah without interruption, or the people who are putting their lives on the line and fighting? And the answer is both. The answer is both. There, in certain respects, one group is greater, you could say, and in the other respect, the other one is greater. So this was the debate in the Talmud as well. What made this 20th day of Av so special? And I suspect that the Rebbe was referring to this because his father was both. His father's obsession was Torah study. His father could go on for hours and hours, like the Rebbe himself. Although someone once told the Rebbe, before the Rebbe became Rebbe, I heard from your father that you surpassed him in knowledge. So the Rebbe says right away, oh, that's what a father has to say. So this chassid was very smart, and he says to the Rebbe, and that's what a son has to say. So this ability to just be totally obsessed with learning. I told a story a few weeks ago. The Rebbe was on a train, an 11-hour trip, and he didn't have a place to sit because the compartment where he was supposed to sit was occupied by a woman, and it wouldn't be proper, wouldn't be modest for him to be there alone with this woman. So he stood on the train between the two cars with a volume of the Talmud. We even know the exact volume, and he stood there for 11 hours studying while the train is moving. His ability of concentration was incredible. And his father likewise had that trait. So he was steeped in Torah. He was a descendant of King David in that regard. But he was also an activist. He also did everything to help other people. During the Second World War, a lot of refugees came from the other parts of Europe, and they ended up in Yekaterinoslav. And they opened the doors for these guests, and they treated them, they fed them, they took care of all their needs. But he also fought the Soviet regime. How many people fought the Soviet regime? Very few. Most of the rabbis who could get out of Russia got out of Russia. Any famous rabbi you know in Israel and from the older generation left Russia when he was still able to leave Russia. The only people who didn't leave Russia was the previous Rebbe, and until he was forced out of Russia, and the Rebbe's father. And these are the two people who took over the mantle of fighting the Soviet regime and keeping Judaism alive. So the Rebbe's father had both qualities. He had the quality of King David, devotion to the Torah study, and he had the quality of Yoav. He was a general. He fought battles, didn't fight with guns, but he still fought with the word of mouth and with his influence. There's another dispute in the Talmud. Well, I won't get into the dispute. We'll go into another aspect of it. As I said before, this family celebrated the 20th day of Av, because that's the day they donated wood to the temple. There was another donation on the 20th of the month of Elul, a month later. It was another family. Now, according to one opinion in the Talmud, it was the same family, but given a different name, different nickname. And the Rebbe explains the difference between the two families corresponds to the difference between the 2 months of Av and Elul. What's the month of Av? Month of Av is a sad month. It's the month in which we suffered 2 major blows. 2 temples were destroyed. It's a month in which we had so many tragedies happening. And Elul is an uplifted month. It's the month in which God's mercy is pronounced, where God is available to everyone. It's an uplifting month. And that reflects 2 different ways in which people help other people who are in need. There are 2 different attitudes. There's an attitude, the Elul attitude. A person who's rich, not just materially, that's not so important, but is spiritually rich, and find someone who's a sinner, who's spiritually impoverished, and you want to help them. You want to donate wood for the temple so they can bring a sacrifice to atone for their sins. How does the sophisticated spiritual elite deal with the unfortunate low-level individual? He looks down. He says, thank God I'm blessed. I don't have your problems. Even in the case of charity, you have someone who's rich and he helps someone who's poor. And he says, look, I'm rich, I have everything. God blessed me, I'm going to share my bountiful money with someone who doesn't have it. So in a sense, it's looking down, it's a certain condescension. It doesn't mean it to hurt the person, but there's still a spirit of, I'm blessed, I'm rich, and I'm going to share some of my wealth with you who are not. And I do it with love, and I do it with joy, and I'll celebrate, make it into a holiday. That's one attitude. That's the Elul attitude. That's the attitude from someone who's uplifted, who's on a spiritual high, and has everything, and doesn't want to keep everything for himself or herself, and looks down at those who are needy and helps them. That's the Elul approach. The Av approach is the opposite. It's the person who looks at himself and says, you know what, I might have certain qualities, but you know what, I'm even lowlier than the person I'm helping. That person who I'm helping is helping me more than I'm helping him or her. Because you feel that your own inadequacy. Yes, people may judge you and say, well, you're the highest, you're the best. But in your own heart, you feel that, you know what, I have so many imperfections. I know myself. The famous story in the Talmud of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the greatest sage of his time, who saved Judaism at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple. And on his deathbed, he started crying. And this is the man who never cried. And the student asked him, why are you crying? He says, because I don't know where I'm going. I might be going into the hot place, to the netherworld. He says, you, of all people? So the Rebbe explains, why was you don't find other people saying the same thing, other righteous people worried about maybe they're not so good after all. He says this Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was so busy saving Jewish life, was so busy teaching and helping people, that he never had an opportunity to introspect. He never had an opportunity to look into his own soul, deep into his own soul, to find out where he's really holding in his spiritual life. So he said to himself, I don't know who I am. I could be rotten to the core, and I cover it up with good deeds. So in other words, you can be a person who's at a very high level. Others look at you that way, but in your own heart, you feel your own inadequacy. And when you come to help someone, you don't do it by looking down at them, by looking up at them, saying, you're probably better than I am. You don't have the shortcomings that I have. That is that Av, the month of Av attitude, a month when you're crushed and you're devastated and you're shattered. And in that month, you go out to help others from humility, not from a high place. And in a footnote of that talk that the Rebbe gave, he says, and my father was the latter approach. he had the of approach. He always looked up at people that he helped, never looked down at anyone. And when I say looking down, I don't mean it in a nasty way, in a disparaging way, but just that's your attitude. I'm a multi-billionaire, and I'm helping someone who's poor, so I recognize my wealth, and I recognize that person's lack of wealth. It's not necessarily a negative, but it's still not done with humility. You're celebrating the opportunity you have to help, but you're not really looking at the person, looking up at them, you're looking down at them. And the Rebbe's father, the Rebbe said, was the latter approach, where he looked up to everyone, and a little bit of a deeper way of understanding why it is that you can look up at someone. If you're helping, you're teaching a student, you know more than the student, so why should you look up at the student if the student is not as smart as you are? Or why should the rich person look up at the poor person, rich in any respect? You're more endowed than the other person. Why should you look up? So if you think about it, you look up because when you help someone, you acquire legitimacy and validity. You validate yourself. Why are we here in this world? The Baal Shem Tov says a soul could come down into this world just to do one favor. Everything else is icing on the cake. So when you do that one favor, and every time you do one favor, it's that one favor for which you exist, you are legitimizing your existence. You're validating your existence. When you're helping a poor person, you're helping them, you're giving them what they need, but it's a temporary thing, a temporary fix. Even if you give them a job, it's going to help them, but it's finite. What you gain is infinite. And that's what the Rebbe's father felt, that every time he helped someone, he felt that he was gaining so much more than the person who he was helping. Let's share something that connected to this from the Rebbe's father's commentary on the Zohar. And this is just a very short thing. He quotes the Zohar, and you can read it on the item 4. Once Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair hosted Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Rabbi Elazar, his scribe. Rabbi Elazar was not his scribe, and his scribe, Rabbi Abba, and his scribe, Rabbi Abba was his scribe, and Rabbi Yitzchak. Okay, please reveal to us a novel teaching on this portion, said Rabbi Pinchas to Rabbi Shimon. Which portion? Asked Rabbi Shimon. The portion that begins, this is the statute of the Torah. That's the portion of the Torah that talks about the laws of the red heifer, the red cow. If someone comes in contact with a dead body, they become ritually unclean. They can't enter the temple. That's one of the reasons why we're not allowed to go on the Temple Mount, in certain parts of the Temple Mount, because we are considered ritually unclean. It doesn't make us bad, but it just means that we have to be outside the limits of the temple, unless we go through a purification process which involves a red cow. And there's a lot of discussion about the red cow in the news these days. The Arabs are going crazy about it because they imported 3 red cows from Texas that if they remain red and nothing is done to them to disqualify them, they would be used to purify people that can go on the Temple Mount and build the temple and so on. So the Arabs are going crazy about it. You might have read that in the news. But anyhow, that's the subject Rabbi Pinchas wanted Rabbi Shimon to expound upon. Of all the subjects in the whole Torah, that was the one thing he wanted. So the Rebbe's father always found connections between the name of the person and the subject that they identify with. So what's the connection between Rabbi Pinchas and the red heifer? So the Rebbe's father explains by citing a passage in the Talmud. When Abraham was pleading with God to spare the people of Sodom, and when he approaches God, what does Abraham say? Who am I? I'm but dust and ashes. That was an expression of humility. So the Talmud says that as a reward for saying, I'm just dust and ashes, his children, the Jewish people, were given the mitzvah of using the ashes of the red heifer. What's the connection? Because he said, I'm like ashes. The hundreds of years later, the Jewish people have a ritual that involves taking a red cow, slaughtering it, and then burning it and using the ashes in a mixture of water, spring water, and sprinkling it on the person who was contaminated. Because Abraham used the word ashes about himself, we got the mitzvah of ashes, of doing a mitzvah with ashes. What's the connection? So the Rebbe's father explains that a Kohen, who's the one who does the ritual of the red cow, the red heifer, while he's purifying the person who is contaminated, the Kohen who's involved in the preparation of that mixture becomes tameh, becomes unclean, becomes impure. In other words, in order to help someone else, there's a cost to you. That's the real sign that your love and your concern for others is genuine, that there's a cost to you. If it's so easy to help others and it doesn't really cost anything, I can just write out a check and it takes 2 seconds and that's all it is. That's a mitzvah, no question about it. But it doesn't really show your devotion, your love and your passion for others unless there's something that you lose, you sacrifice in order to help someone else. So that's what the Kohen, when he prepares the mixture of the ashes of the red cow, that's a sign that he's totally humble and doesn't care about his or her own interests when someone else's interests come into the picture. That's what Abraham meant when he says, I'm ashes. When Abraham was a paragon of virtue, he was the man who epitomized kindness to the extreme. But Abraham's kindness was not a convenient kind of kindness. And I'm not trying to knock it, it doesn't make it bad, but Abraham's kindness was what the Zohar calls complete love. And that's what the Kohen exhibited. When the Kohen would prepare the mixture to help a person who became contaminated, and he became contaminated as a result, that's the sign that he was truly an heir to Abraham, he said to himself, I am but dust and ashes. Abraham exhibited this complete love, and the Kohen also exhibited complete love. And that's why Rabbi Pinchas was so obsessed with hearing some teaching on that subject. Because Rabbi Pinchas, what was he known for? Rabbi Pinchas was known for risking his life to save captives. In those days, it was very common for people to be, as it is today, if you go to the southern border, people kidnapped and sold into slavery. And he would go out of his way and find ways of raising money and finding ways of saving captives. So his love and his concern was not the incomplete one. Yeah, it's convenient, and on the weekend I have a few minutes, I can do some volunteer work, and it's very nice. It's socially very, very satisfying, which is all great and wonderful. But that's not complete love. Complete love is when it's at your own expense. And that's what Rabbi Pinchas, that was his whole life, and that's why he wanted to hear something meaningful about the laws concerning the ashes, because it's an expression. And that ties in with Rabbi Levi Yitzchak's very life. His life was the one of complete love, a life of sacrificing for others, and putting others ahead of himself. And that's the hallmark of all the great Chabad Rebbes. He was not the Rebbe, although there's I don't know the validity of it, I'm not sure of the source of it, but there was something going around Hasidim who were pointing to the fact that the third Chabad Rebbe, who the Rebbe was named after, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, when he passed away, he had 6 sons. And he wanted his youngest son to succeed him. But that would be an affront to his oldest son, who was a very great man. His name was Baruch Shalom. So the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe, told his oldest son, if you don't accept the position of leader, you remain just a follower, I will guarantee that it will return to the family after 4 generations. That means 4 generations later of your descendants will become the leader of the Hasidim. Well, when the previous Rebbe's father passed away, who was the 4th generation? The Rebbe's father. of all the other descendants, he was like the most prominent. So he thought that maybe his role was to become the Rebbe. But he didn't. The Rebbe was the Rebbe's father-in-law, who was a distant cousin. So he was like, he felt that he didn't understand. I thought that it was supposed to come back to the fourth generation. When the Rebbe became the son-in-law of the previous Rebbe, he says, now I understand. I miscalculated the 4 generations. And it's the Rebbe who's going to become the leader. That's a story that goes around. I can't vouch for its authenticity, but that's a story that's... So we know a little bit about the Rebbe's father, and the Rebbe wanted that we should not just look at him as someone on a pedestal, but to emulate his behavior to the extent that we can, both to our devotion to the study of Torah and our devotion to activism and helping others. Any questions?
So did the Rebbe's father know that the Rebbe became the Rebbe?
No. He passed away in 1944, and the Rebbe became Rebbe in 1951. So he didn't know, but he knew that according to this story, once he was a son-in-law, that meant that he would probably succeed his father-in-law, because his father-in-law had no sons. And he knew that his son was worthy of becoming the Rebbe. He knew his son. I mean, that story that he said that my son surpassed me in knowledge, and that's when the Rebbe was just a teenager or in his 20s. So I'll just tell you another story that I just saw on the video a few days ago. The Rebbe commissioned a chassid, his name was Rabbi Naftali Gottlieb, of blessed memory, to write a biography of his father, a 3-volume biography. But before he submitted it to be printed, the Rebbe had to look it over to make sure that it was accurate. And there were about 5 different places where he writes about the Rebbe himself, what his father said about the Rebbe, his praises. The Rebbe took all of that out. He said none of that should go in the book. The Rebbe didn't want that the book should be about him, it should be about his father. I know the story that one of the stories that he took out, I'll share that story. I heard it from the man who heard it directly from the Rebbe's father. There's this chassid whose name was Lazer Nanas. He spent 20 years in paradise in the Gulag. Imagine that, a paid vacation. You can go skiing, I guess, in Siberia. That's what they did. So he was in the Gulag 20 years, and miraculously he survived. When he came to the Rebbe told him, those 20 years of your life do not count. You're going to get an extra 20 years. And he lived to the age of 100. He got engaged at the age of 98. That was not his first wife, though.
Did he get married?
I assume so. He passed away at the age of 100, so he had 2 very good years. So when he got out of Russia... When he got out of Russia, he spoke publicly and he told many stories. There's a book that he wrote, an autobiography called Subato, with a pseudonym, with a fake name, because it was too dangerous, even after he got out of Russia in the 80s, the 70s and 80s, to publicize the things that he writes about. So he doesn't have his real name. But anyhow, he told a story that he was a student in the city of Lubavitch. That's where the major Chabad institution was, and this was in the years. The yeshiva shut down, I think, by World War I. No, I think it lasted till 1920, if I'm not mistaken. At any rate, he was a student there, and the Rebbe, who was then the Rebbe, the 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Shalom Dovber, summoned him and told him to go home, to leave the yeshiva and go home. He says, on the way, stop off in Yekaterinoslav and give this envelope to Rabbi Levi Yitzchak. So he comes to Rabbi Levi Yitzchak. He has a sealed envelope. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak doesn't open the envelope, and he says, and it seems that he knew what was in it. And he says, come with me, I want to show you something. And he takes him to a room. He opens the door, and there's a young man in his teens, I guess, sitting and studying, and oblivious to the fact that they opened the door and they're watching him. Says this young man knows all of the Talmud by heart and all the commentaries, and he went on praising him. And one day he will help you. And he closed the door, and that was it. Well, how did it help him? I just heard this last night, someone told me. Obviously, the Rebbe helped in getting him out of Russia, but it helped him another way. The Soviets were such ruthless, evil people. When the previous Rebbe passed away, they thought they're going to capitalize on that, and they told the Hasidim who were in prisons or in the Gulag, you know, your Rebbe died, to break them, to crush them. Because what kept them going was the fact that they had a Rebbe, that they knew that the Rebbe was thinking about them and praying for them. And now that he's gone, and some Hasidim were crushed. But this Leisenanis was not. That's what the Rebbe's father told me, that this young man will help you someday. That means he was intimating that he will become the Rebbe. So he said, we do have a Rebbe, even though the previous Rebbe passed away, this Rebbe is still here. And that gave him the strength to go on and not be crushed. Okay, any other questions? Okay, everyone have a good week.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any questions on Zoom?